The first thing Fannie Vaughn did when she rode into Harlan County, Texas, in the spring of 1882, was nearly knock Abraham Talbot off his own front porch with the sheer velocity of her arrival. She came over the crest of the red clay hill at a full gallop, her chestnut mare kicking up a rooster tail of dust so thick it looked like the earth itself was trying to swallow her whole, and she did not slow down until she was close enough to the hitching post that the mare's breath steamed against the painted wood. The horse stopped on a dime. Fannie Vaughn did not fall, did not sway, did not even shift in the saddle. She simply sat there atop that heaving animal as though she had arrived by invitation and found the whole world a little beneath her expectations. Abraham Talbot stood on the porch of the Rocking T Ranch house with a mug of coffee going cold in his hand and stared at her. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders, with sun-darkened skin and dark eyes that missed very little. He had built the Rocking T from a single-quarter section of cracked hardpan into 400 acres of working cattle land, and he was not a man given to easy surprise. But he stood there with that cooling coffee and stared. The woman on the horse was somewhere in her mid-20s. She had a worn leather hat pulled low over auburn hair that the wind had worked loose from whatever arrangement she had started the day with, and she wore trail clothes that had seen genuine trail. Her boots were good quality but scuffed past any vanity. Her eyes, when she finally looked down at him from the saddle, were the sharp green of early spring grass after rain, and they were measuring him just as quickly as he was measuring her. "I am looking for the Rocking T," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, with a slight drawl that did not quite match Texas. Tennessee, maybe, or Kentucky, somewhere the hills were green and the people were stubborn. "You found it," Abraham said. "Then you would be Abraham Talbot." "I would." She swung down from the saddle in one clean motion and looped the mare's reins around the hitching post with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 10,000 times on 10,000 different posts. Then she walked up the 2 porch steps and held out her hand as though they were meeting in a parlor and not on a dusty ranch at the edge of nowhere. "Fannie Vaughn," she said. "I answered your advertisement in the San Antonio Express." Abraham shook her hand because it would have been rude not to, and because her grip was firm and direct, and there was something about it that made a man want to respond in kind. He had placed that advertisement 3 weeks ago, in a moment of desperation that he had not fully admitted to himself even now. He needed help. The Rocking T needed help. He had been running the spread with 2 aging ranch hands and his own increasingly exhausted body for the better part of 2 years, ever since his foreman had left to follow a girl to California, and his other good hand had broken his leg at the roundup and never fully healed right. The advertisement had asked for an experienced ranch hand, someone who knew cattle and horses and the land, and he had written it in deliberately neutral language, because a man in 1882 did not advertise for a woman wrangler without inviting half the county to have opinions about it. He had received 12 responses. 11 of them were men. The 12th was Fannie Vaughn, and her letter had been 3 paragraphs long, and had told him more about cattle management and water rights and seasonal pasture rotation than any of the men's letters combined. She had listed her experience concisely: 7 years working her late father's ranch in eastern Tennessee, 3 years on a trail drive circuit between the Brazos River Valley and the Panhandle, and the last year and a half managing a remuda for a horse breeding operation outside of Uvalde that had recently closed when the owner died. He had written back asking when she could arrive. She had written back saying she would arrive when she arrived, and that she expected fair wages and a fair chance and nothing more. He had found himself oddly charmed by the terseness of it, and here she was. "I did not expect you quite so soon," he said. "I do not linger when I have somewhere to be," she said. "Are you going to show me the operation, or are we going to stand here on your porch until sunset?" He almost smiled. He showed her the operation. The Rocking T was not a large ranch by the standards of the great Texas spreads, but it was a serious one. Abraham had 240 head of cattle, a remuda of 14 horses, a bunkhouse that currently housed his two hands, old Gideon Marsh and a quieter man named Cole Purvis, and a barn that needed repainting, and a roof section that needed replacing before the summer storms came. The land ran from the creek bottom in the east up across rolling limestone hills to the west, where the grass got short and tough, and the cattle had to work for their grazing. There was a good water situation overall, with the creek and 2 functioning stock tanks, but one of the tanks had been silting up and needed to be cleared. Fannie walked all of it with him, and she did not ask many questions. Mostly she watched. She walked the fence lines with her eyes, noted where the wire was rusting, noted where the posts had heaved with the winter frost and sat crooked. She looked at the cattle with the attentive patience of someone cataloging rather than admiring. She stopped at the silted stock tank and crouched at the edge of it and ran her fingers through the accumulated mud and silt and said, mostly to herself, that it would need pulling before July. Yes, Abraham said. She stood and looked at the western hills. You are running your heavy grazers in the wrong pasture, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement delivered with the same flat certainty she might have used to note that the sky was blue. The West Hills grass is your recovery grass. You push your heaviest cattle on it now, before the summer, you will have bare limestone by August and nothing to recover to. Abraham looked at her. He had in fact been thinking exactly this for the past 2 weeks and had been putting off the decision to move the herd because moving cattle alone with 2 hands was a considerable undertaking. You have not even been here an hour, he said. The land does not require me to be here longer to tell me what I am seeing, she said. She turned those green eyes on him, and there was no challenge in them, not exactly. There was simply the uncomplicated confidence of someone who knew what she knew. You have good land here, Mr. Talbot. You are just not using it in the order that suits it best. He stood there in the afternoon sun looking at this woman who had appeared on his property like a force of nature and was now diagnosing his grazing strategy with the ease of a doctor reading a chart, and he felt something shift in his chest, not romantically, not yet. It was simpler than that and more fundamental. It was the recognition that sometimes a person arrives exactly when they are needed. The bunkhouse has a partition, he said. The east side is yours. It is private enough. I have slept in worse, she said, and picked up the saddle bag she had set down at her feet and walked toward the bunkhouse like the matter was entirely settled. It was. Gideon Marsh, who was 63 years old and had been working cattle since before the war, took one look at Fannie Vaughn over the supper table that first evening and said, "Well, I'll be. You actually found a real one." Cole Purvis, who was 26 and generally said very little, nodded once, which from Cole was practically a speech. Fannie ate her supper and asked Gideon about the ranch's history and the land's history, and what the summers here had been like. And Gideon, who loved to talk and rarely had anyone who wanted to listen to him, talked until the lamp oil was getting low. Abraham sat at the head of the table and watched the ease with which she pulled stories from the old man, the attentive quality of her listening, the way she asked follow-up questions that proved she had actually heard what was said. He noticed these things the way a man notices small things when something is interesting to him, without yet knowing exactly why. The next morning she was up before dawn. Abraham came out of the ranch house in the gray pre-light and found her already in the corral with the horses, moving through the remuda with quiet authority, introducing herself to each animal with her hands and her voice before she asked anything of them. He stood at the fence and watched. She did not see him. She was entirely present with the horses, and the horses, who were animals of precise instinct, responded to her with a kind of calm trust that took most people weeks to earn. He should have gone in to start the day's work. He stayed at the fence another 10 minutes. The first 2 weeks were a revelation, though Abraham was careful not to say so. Fannie worked alongside Gideon and Cole without ego and without the complicated social frictions he had half expected. She was direct without being abrasive. She was efficient without being cold. When she had a better way of doing something, she said so, and when someone else had a better way, she acknowledged it without ceremony. She did not ask for accommodation, and she did not tolerate condescension, of which there was initially some, because Cole Purvis had grown up in a part of Texas where women did not work cattle, and he was working through the gap between what he had been raised to believe and what he was watching with his own eyes. The moment that resolved it came on the 10th day. Cole had said, with the kind of bluntness that passes for honesty in young men who have not yet learned the difference, that he did not think she ought to be the one to sort the temperamental bay gelding that had been causing problems in the remuda, because that horse was too dangerous for someone who was not built for the work. Fannie had looked at Cole Purvis for a long, steady moment. Then she had gone to the corral, caught the bay gelding, saddled him, and ridden him in the near pasture for 40 minutes while the horse expressed every objection he had, and she answered each one with patience and firm, consistent pressure until the bay gave up his arguments and accepted her guidance. When she brought him back through the gate, she was not even breathing particularly hard. Cole never said anything like that again. In fact, within the month he had started watching how she approached difficult horses the way an apprentice watches a master, with a kind of hungry attention he would not have admitted to openly. Abraham watched it all. He was working every day beside her now, shoulder to shoulder, and he noticed things. He noticed that she sang to herself when she was doing repetitive work, old songs he half recognized, the kind that came from the hills and hollers of the eastern ranges. He noticed that she ate with appetite and without apology, which he found he liked in a person. He noticed that when something frustrated her, she went quiet rather than loud, and the quality of that quiet was very specific, a turned inward kind of silence that meant she was solving something. He noticed that she laughed quickly and genuinely when something struck her as funny, a real laugh, not the polite kind. He did not let himself examine these observations too closely. He was her employer. She was here to work. The lines were clear, and he was a man who respected clear lines. On the 15th day of her employment, a problem arrived that put those lines under their first pressure. A man named Hector Gill rode in with 2 of his cowboys from the neighboring /H spread. Hector Gill was 44, wealthy by local standards, accustomed to getting what he wanted from the county, and he had been making quiet offers on the Rocking T's western parcel for 2 years. Abraham had declined them all. Hector Gill had not been dissuaded so much as he had been temporarily delayed. He pulled up to the yard and looked around with the proprietary air of a man who considers everything in his sight line to be either already his or soon to become his, and he nodded to Abraham and then let his eyes settle on Fannie, who was mending a fence section near the barn. "You hired a girl," he said. It was not quite mocking. It was the specific tone of a man who uses the word girl as a diminishment and knows he is doing it. "I hired an experienced ranch hand," Abraham said. His voice was even. "What can I do for you, Hector?" Hector Gill talked about the western parcel. He made another offer, couched in language that implied Abraham would be foolish not to accept it, and he kept looking over at Fannie while he talked, as though her presence was a detail that needed explaining. Fannie kept mending the fence. She did not look up, but Abraham noticed that her hands had stilled on the wire. "My answer is the same as before," Abraham said. "The western parcel is not for sale." Hector Gill looked at him for a moment, then back at Fannie, and then he smiled the kind of smile that does not reach the eyes. "Well, you know where to find me when you change your mind," he said, and rode out with his 2 cowboys behind him. After the dust settled, Fannie walked over, wiping her hands on a rag. "He is going to be a problem," she said. "He has always been a problem," Abraham said. "Nothing new in that. He looked at this land the way some men look at things they have decided to take," she said. "That is a different kind of problem." Abraham looked at her. She was right. He knew she was right. He had known it for a while, but had found it easier to frame Hector Gill as an annoyance than a genuine threat. "I know it," he said. She nodded. "Then let us make sure the western parcel's fencing is in good repair," she said. and let us move that cattle rotation before he or his hands start noting which pastures are overworked. It was practical advice about land management, and it was also something else, a declaration of allegiance that she made quietly and without fanfare, as though it were simply obvious. This is your land. I will help you keep it. He felt the warmth of it settle in his chest. That evening they sat on the porch after supper, a thing that had become a small, informal habit without either of them deciding to make it one. And the night was warm, and the stars over the Texas hill country were so thick they looked structural, like the sky needed them to hold itself up. "Where are you from originally?" he asked. He had been careful not to ask too many personal questions. He did not want her to feel that employment came with interrogation. "Eastern Tennessee," she said. "A place called Bledsoe County. We had a farm. My father ran cattle and tobacco and a few horses." She paused. "He died when I was 22. The land went to debts. I came west." "By yourself?" "There was not anyone left to come with," she said. She did not say it with self-pity. She said it with the flat factuality of someone who has made their peace with a hard truth. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Coming west alone?" She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I was afraid of staying," she said. That seemed worse. He thought about that. He had come to Texas from Arkansas when he was 22, which was 9 years ago now, and he had come for similar reasons, not debts, but the feeling of a horizon that was too close, a life that was already mapped before he had agreed to the map. "I understand that," he said. She looked at him then, and something passed between them in the dark that had not quite been there before. Not words, not even an acknowledged feeling. Just the recognition that they were speaking the same language, the one that people who have made themselves from nothing speak to each other. "What brought you to this particular piece of Texas?" she asked. He smiled. "I drove through it in 1873 with $30 and a horse that was already old, and I looked at those hills and I thought that could be mine. It was that simple and that unreasonable." She smiled too, and it changed her whole face. Most true things are. He watched her smile and felt the shift in his chest again, stronger now, less easy to categorize as simply the recognition of competence. He looked away at the dark hills and did not say anything else for a while. But the silence between them was comfortable in a way that silences usually are not between people who have known each other only 2 weeks. 3 days after Hector Gill's visit, something happened that crystallized the nature of what Fannie Vaughn was. Abraham had gone into the town of Larkin Creek to settle a bill at the feed store and pick up supplies. He left Fannie in charge of the day's work, which was the movement of the heavy grazing cattle from the western hills to the eastern creek bottom, a process that required all 3 hands working together and precise management of where the cattle went once they were in motion. He came back in the early afternoon to find the cattle moved and settled, which he had expected. What he had not expected was that, in the process of moving them, Fannie had spotted a section of the north fence that had been breached and had ridden 3 miles to check, and found that 11 head of cattle had got through and wandered onto the unfenced land between the rocking T and the neighboring cowhound spread. She had collected them herself, riding the terrain she had been on for only 2 weeks, tracking the scattered animals across broken country, and had them back in the correct pasture before noon. Gideon told him about it when he rode in, with the breathless relish of an old man who has just seen something worth seeing. Abraham went to find Fannie. She was at the water tank washing up, and she looked at him when he came over with an expression that was half reading him and half simply tired, the good tired of hard work honestly done. "Gideon told me," he said. "It needed doing," she said. "The fence section wants a full replacement, not a patch. I pulled it tight enough for now, but it will not hold through the summer." "Fannie," he said, and something about the way he said her name made her go still. He had been calling her Miss Vaughn for 2 weeks. He had not realized the shift until it was already out of his mouth. "I appreciate what you did today." She looked at him steadily. "You pay me for it," she said. "Not well enough to track 11 head across broken country alone. I have run wilder land than this," she said. He stared at her. The setting sun was behind her, and it put a rim of copper light around her hair, and she was looking at him with those green eyes, and she had just said the simplest and most confident thing he had ever heard from another person. He did not plan what he did next. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the leather folding case that held the ranch keys and documents, and from it he took the set of reins he had been carrying since morning, the good braided leather reins of the ranch's best cutting horse, a rangy gray mare named Jubilee that he trusted above almost anything he owned. He held them out. "Prove it," he said. She looked at the reins. She looked at him. There was a long, charged moment in which the afternoon breeze moved through the yard, and somewhere in the oak tree by the barn, a mockingbird went through its catalog of borrowed songs. Then she reached out and took the reins from his hand, and when she did, her fingers brushed his palm, and neither of them moved for just a fraction of a second longer than was strictly necessary. Then she was gone to the barn. He stood in the yard and listened to her saddle Jubilee, and then she came out through the barn doors on that gray mare like something out of a dream, and she rode west toward the limestone hills at a pace that made his breath catch. Not reckless, but absolutely free, the horse and the rider moving together with the unified fluency of two things that understand each other completely. He watched until she was a small shape against the big Texas sky, and then a smaller shape, and then gone over the ridge line. She came back at dusk, and Jubilee was sweat-damp and bright-eyed and satisfied, and Fannie Vaughn's hat had blown back on its cord, and her hair was entirely loose and wild from the wind, and she was, in that moment, the most vivid thing he had ever seen. She rode into the yard and looked down at him from the saddle, and her eyes were brilliant. "Satisfied?" he asked. "Getting there," she said, and she smiled. He was entirely lost after that, though he did not know it yet. He was the kind of man who needed time to understand his own feelings, because he had always lived so much in the practical, and the immediate that the internal landscape was less familiar terrain. But the process had started, and there was no unstarting it. They fell into a rhythm over the following weeks that was both entirely about the work and entirely about everything else. They worked the cattle together during the days, debated grazing strategy and water management in the evenings, and sat on the porch after dark in a silence that had by now become one of the most comfortable things Abraham had ever experienced. Fannie was not a woman who needed to fill quiet, and he was not a man who did either, and the shared silence between two people who chose it together rather than just tolerating it is a form of intimacy that is older than language. She told him about the trail drives, piece by piece over successive evenings, the way a person tells a long story, not all at once but in installments, as though measuring how much of it the listener can hold. She had been the only woman on 3 drives, and had learned quickly which men would respect work that spoke for itself, and which ones needed additional convincing, and she had various methods of providing that convincing, most of them involving being better at the job than anyone who doubted her. She talked about the land she had crossed, the big empty country west of the Pecos, the brutal beauty of the staked plains, the way the Rio Grande looked in flood, red and enormous and indifferent to everything human. He told her about building the rocking T the first winter, which had been harder than any arithmetic could have prepared him for. The year the creek flooded and took 40 head. The drought that had followed 2 years later, and the terrible decisions of a man trying to hold land against the weather. He found that he talked more freely to her than he had talked to anyone in years, perhaps because she listened with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, fully present, not waiting for her turn to speak, but actually hearing. Gideon noticed. He said nothing, because Gideon was old enough to know when not to say things, but his eyes were warm and knowing whenever he watched the two of them together, and sometimes he found reasons to leave a room they were both in. Cole noticed too. He was young enough to find it interesting rather than complicated, and occasionally made comments that were more transparent than he realized. Things like, "I'll get started on the north fence. You two figure out the tank plan, said with studied casualness that was about as subtle as a dropped anvil. In town, people talked. Larkin Creek was a small community, roughly 400 souls in the town proper and another several hundred spread across the surrounding ranches and homesteads, and it had the economy of gossip that all small communities have. A woman ranch hand at the rocking tea was already interesting. The particular quality of attention that Abraham Talbot paid to that ranch hand was additional material for speculation. Fannie heard the talk when she went to town for supplies and regarded it with the equanimity of someone who had been talked about before and found it generally unable to hurt her. What was less easy to manage was Hector Gill. He came back a second time, 6 weeks after the first visit. He brought a lawyer from Uvalde with him this time, a thin man named Beaumont with a paper collar and a briefcase, and he made a formal offer on not just the western parcel but the entire rocking tea, couched in terms that were designed to sound like generosity while being, on examination, about 30% below the land's genuine value. Abraham sat at the kitchen table with the papers in his hands, and Fannie sat across from him reading the same papers, and when she set her portion down, she looked at him with an expression that was calm and furious in equal measure. "He is not buying land," she said. "He is trying to buy you out at distress prices before you have a chance to develop the western water rights." "What do you mean?" "There is a spring on the western parcel," she said. She pulled a hand-drawn map from her pocket, a map he had not seen before that she had apparently made herself from her rides over the land. "I found it 3 weeks ago. It is covered over with brush, but it is running. You likely do not know what that is worth for water rights in this county." He looked at her map. She had marked the spring location with precision. He had walked that land for 9 years and had not found it. "You have been mapping the land," he said. "I map every piece of land I work," she said. "It is a habit." He was silent for a moment, not with surprise but with something closer to awe. She had come to his land and in 6 weeks had understood it more comprehensively than he had in 9 years, not because she was smarter than him, but because she looked at land the way a doctor looks at a patient, with systematic and generous attention. "I am not selling," he said. "I know you are not selling," she said. "But you need to file on that spring before Gill finds it himself, and you should talk to a lawyer about the water rights documentation." He looked at her across the kitchen table, and the lamp was burning between them and her face was lit on one side and in shadow on the other, and she was looking at him with those green eyes, and he thought, with a clarity that was almost alarming, "I do not want to manage this ranch without her." He also thought, immediately after, that there was a significant difference between not wanting to manage a ranch without someone and being in love with them, and that he should be careful about confusing the two. He was not being careful enough. The complication arrived not from Hector Gill, but from an unexpected direction. A letter came for Fannie, delivered through the Larkin Creek post office, and she read it at the supper table and then sat with it folded in her hands for a long time. "Bad news?" he asked. "A man named Dalton Prue," she said, "who ran the horse operation in Uvalde where I worked. He died last year, I told you. He left the operation to his nephew, who is now trying to sell it. His lawyer has found me to say there is a small matter of wages owed to me from the last 3 months I worked there, which the nephew apparently intends to contest." She paused. "It is not much money, but it is what I am owed. Do you need to go to Uvalde?" "I do not know yet." She looked at the letter again. "The lawyer says it can likely be handled by correspondence if I have documentation." "Do you have documentation?" "I keep records of everything," she said, and there was a faint dry humor in it that made him smile without meaning to. "Write back," he said. "Tell them to correspond here. I have a lockbox in the office where you can keep anything important. You do not have to handle it from the road." She looked at him. It was a small thing, the offer of a lockbox and an address, but it was also something more. It was the offer of a stable place, a home base, a permanence that their arrangement did not technically require but that he was offering anyway. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was quiet in a way that it was not usually quiet. He nodded and looked at his supper plate and told himself that the warmth he felt was simply the satisfaction of being useful. He was lying to himself, and he was starting to know it. The summer came on hard and fast, as Texas summers do, with a heat that settled over the land like a physical weight. The cattle work intensified, and the days were long and exhausting, and beautiful in the specific way that exhausting, beautiful work is beautiful. The way you fall into bed at night feeling entirely used up and entirely alive. Fannie was in the thick of it every day, riding alongside Abraham in the hands, managing the remuda, working the cattle, making decisions that proved consistently sound. She had developed an additional relationship with the land that went beyond management. She knew the mockingbird in the oak tree, had named him Henry, and sometimes left pieces of food out for him, which Gideon found deeply amusing. She had planted a small kitchen garden on the south side of the ranch house, tomatoes and beans and a few herbs, not because it was her house, but because she said a ranch house without a kitchen garden was missing something. Abraham had not objected. He had, in fact, found himself going to the kitchen garden sometimes in the early mornings just to see what was coming up. One evening in late June he came to find her there, crouched in the garden's narrow rows, pulling weeds in the last of the day's light. He crouched down across from her without being invited, which he would not have done 3 months ago, and helped pull weeds without saying anything. They worked in companionable silence for a while. "I got a letter from my sister today," he said finally. He had a sister named Ruth in Arkansas, whom he wrote to occasionally and saw once every several years. "She is coming to visit in September." Fannie looked at him. "She know the arrangements here?" she asked. She meant, does she know a woman is working your ranch? "I told her I had hired an experienced hand," he said. "She will have questions." "Sisters usually do," Fannie said. A pause. "Is she difficult?" "She is very particular," he said carefully. "She has views." Fannie nodded slowly. She pulled a stubborn weed with a sharp tug. "I expect I will manage," she said. "I know you will," he said. "I am not worried about you. I am worried about her." He paused. "Ruth likes to form opinions quickly and present them as established facts. I love her, but she does not always get things right." Fannie looked at him with something that might have been amusement. "Are you warning me about your sister, Mr. Talbot?" He noticed the Mr. Talbot, which she used sometimes still when she wanted to put a small formal distance between them, a habit from the first weeks that she had not entirely given up. He looked at her in the garden's soft evening light and said, "I think you can call me Abraham by now." She was quiet for a moment. "Abraham," she said, and it was just his name, only his name, but the way she said it made something in his chest ache in a way that was not unpleasant but was also not simple. "Fannie," he said. They looked at each other across the narrow rows of the kitchen garden in the fading Texas light, and neither of them spoke for a moment. And then she looked down at the garden bed, and he looked at the sky, and they finished weeding in silence that had changed its quality slightly, become more charged with the unsaid. And when they went in for supper, they were both perhaps a little more careful with their words and a little less successful at being casual. The summer deepened. Hector Gill made 2 more approaches, one through a middleman and one directly, and both times Abraham declined clearly and finally. He had filed on the spring, on Fannie's advice, and had the water rights documentation in order. The spring was good, genuinely good, a reliable source that would make the western parcel significantly more valuable for grazing and potentially for a second stock tank. Gill's interest in the land, once the spring's existence was confirmed through the filing process, became more aggressive in its pressure and more veiled in its methods. Gill's cowboys started riding the fence lines, not crossing them. Just riding them close enough to be visible from the rocking tee's higher ground, in numbers large enough to be a message. Abraham saw it. Fannie saw it. Gideon sharpened his rifle, which Abraham told him was premature, and Cole Purvis started sleeping with a hand near his gun, which Abraham found more understandable. On a Wednesday afternoon in late July, Fannie came back from a solo fence-riding circuit of the western boundary, and told Abraham that Gil's men had widened the trail that ran along the western fence line, a trail that technically bordered the Rocking T's boundary, and had positioned what looked like a temporary line camp about a quarter-mile from the corner post. "He is not going to come over the fence," she said. "He is going to make you uncomfortable enough that you want to sell." "He has overestimated how much I value comfort," Abraham said. "Or he is planning to dispute the fence line itself," she said. "If he has a surveyor come in and claim the boundary is in the wrong place, even if it is wrong, it will cost you time and money to fight." Abraham sat down on the porch steps and ran his hand through his hair. He had been fighting for this land for 9 years, and the fighting was familiar, but that did not make it less wearing. Fannie sat down on the step beside him, which she had not done before. They had always taken their separate porch chairs. She sat close enough that her arm was almost against his. "I know someone who is a good land surveyor," she said. "A man named Everett Dean, who worked the river bottoms between here and Laredo. He is thorough and he is respected by the county courts. If you get him out here before Gil makes a move, you have the definitive record." He turned his head to look at her. She was close enough that he could see the detail of her, the small scar at her jaw line that she had gotten from a fence wire years ago, the way a few freckles crossed her nose that only showed in strong sunlight. She was looking at the western hills with her practical problem-solving expression, and he was very aware of every inch of the space between them. "How do you know about this man?" he said. "I have been around," she said simply. "You have," he agreed. She turned then and found him looking at her, and for a moment neither of them manufactured an expression. They were just looking at each other, and everything that had been accumulating since the day she rode in at a gallop and nearly knocked him off his own porch was sitting in the air between them like the charge before a lightning storm. He said, very quietly, "Fannie." She said nothing, but she did not look away. He reached out and covered her hand with his, where it rested on the porch step between them, and he felt her breath change, a slight catch, and then her hand turned under his and her fingers closed around his in the most deliberate and clear gesture he had ever received from another human being. They sat like that for a long moment in the late afternoon heat with the western hills red-orange before them, and the sound of the ranch going on around them. The distant cattle and the closer horses and Gideon singing to himself in the bunkhouse, and Abraham felt something inside him settle into a new position, like a stone that has been balanced wrong and finds its right angle. He did not say anything more. She did not either, but when she finally drew her hand back it was slowly, almost reluctantly, and when she stood up to go in for supper she looked at him from the doorway for a beat longer than she needed to, and her eyes were very warm. He sat on the porch for a while after she went in, looking at the evening hills, and he thought, so this is what this is. He wrote to Everett Dean the next day. August was the month that tested everything. First, 2 of Abraham's cows freshened with calves that were struggling to thrive in the heat, and Fannie spent 3 consecutive nights in the barn nursing them through the worst of it, sleeping on hay when she slept at all. Abraham spelled her when he could, and there were hours in the deep of the night, with the barn lit by a single lantern and the smell of hay and warm animal and the quiet outside enormous, when they sat together with the sick calves and talked in low voices about things that had nothing to do with cattle, his memories of Arkansas, her memories of Tennessee, the landscape of childhood, the texture of grief. She told him about her mother, who had died when Fannie was 14, and about how her father had been a different man after that, harder and quieter, pouring himself into the land with an intensity that was grief in disguise. She told him about learning to do the full work of the ranch because there was no one else, and how at the time she had resented it fiercely, and in retrospect understood that it had given her something irreplaceable. He told her about leaving Arkansas, the fight with his father that had preceded it, the things that had been said that had never quite been unsaid before the older man died, the particular weight of words you cannot take back from someone you cannot get back to. "Do you regret leaving?" she asked. "No," he said, "I regret the leaving being ugly, but not the leaving itself," she nodded, That is an honest answer. I try to be honest, he said. He paused. Though I think lately I have been less honest with myself than I ought to be. She looked at him across the lantern. The calves were quiet, breathing steadily now past the worst of it. About what, she asked, and her voice was soft. About why it matters to me that you are here, he said. He held her gaze. He was not a man who said things like this easily, but he was a man who, having decided to say something, said it plainly. I tell myself it is because you are good at the work, which is true. But that is not the whole truth. She was very still. Fannie, he said. I know, she said quietly. I know, Abraham. Then perhaps you could tell me, he said, and there was something almost hesitant in it which was not his usual mode, whether I am reading this wrong. She looked at him for a long time. The lantern threw warm light across her face and her eyes were the color of dark leaves. You are not reading it wrong, she said. He let out a breath he had not known he was holding. She smiled then, small and real, the smile that changed her whole face, and the calf between them moved its head and blinked at the lantern light with large, placid, entirely unimpressed eyes. And Fannie laughed a low, soft laugh, and Abraham laughed too, and it was the best moment he had had in years. They did not change anything overnight. They were practical people, and the situation required practicality. She was still his employee. The ranch was in a contested position with Gil. Ruth was arriving in September. Nothing about diving recklessly into feelings seemed wise, but they were different with each other after that night in the barn, in ways that were not entirely invisible even if they were mostly quiet. He brought her coffee in the mornings. She left the best pieces of whatever was in the kitchen garden for him. They rode out together to check the western boundaries, just the two of them, and talked about the land and about other things too, easy and ranging conversations that covered everything from the state of Texas politics to the question of whether Henry the Mockingbird had recently expanded his territory, which Fannie maintained he had. Everett Dean arrived in late August. He was a compact, serious man in his 50s who moved over the land with a surveyor's meticulous patience, and he confirmed within 3 days that every one of the Rocking T's boundary posts was correctly placed. He provided a certified survey document that Abraham filed with the county record's office in Larkin Creek. When Hector Gill's attorney subsequently raised questions about the fence line, the county clerk showed him the filed documentation, and the questions were answered. Gill did not give up, but he had fewer tools now, and Abraham had better footing. The immediate threat of forced displacement receded. The day Everett Dean finished his survey and was paid and rode out, Abraham found Fannie at the stock tank, the one they had been clearing of silt over several working sessions, and she was waist-deep in the murky water in old work clothes, moving the last of the accumulated silt to the bank with a flat shovel. It was honest labor, and she was committed to it with the same total physical presence she brought to everything. He stood at the tank's edge and looked at her. I could have had Cole finish that, he said. Cole has the north fence, she said without looking up. She drove the shovel into another load of silt. Besides, I started it. He pulled off his boots and his jacket and waded in beside her, and they finished clearing the tank together in the late afternoon, working in the specific comfortable companionship of people who have arrived at a place past the need to be impressive with each other. When the tank was clear and they had waded out and were sitting in the grass drying in the last of the sun, she said, "He will try again." Gil, yes, he is not the kind of man who accepts a settled situation. He will look for a different angle. I know it, Abraham said. He was quiet for a moment. I have been thinking about the ranch's future. She waited. I have been running this place with the aim of keeping it, he said. Survival as the primary goal. But I think I have been so focused on holding what I have that I have not thought enough about what it could become. She turned to look at him. Tell me, she said. That spring on the western parcel, he said. If we develop it right, run a proper pipe from it to a third stock tank, we could support another 100 head. That would change the operation's income substantially. It would also make the rocking tea large enough that Gil's interest in absorbing it becomes less practical because the cost to him goes up. She nodded slowly. That is right, she said. And if you develop the western water, the land up there becomes your best summer pasture instead of your most vulnerable. It flips the whole geometry of the ranch. Yes, he said, I would need capital, and I would need someone who could manage the expanded operation. She heard something in his voice and looked at him directly. Fannie, he said, I'm trying to say something that I may not be saying very well. You are saying it fine, she said. I want you to stay, he said, not as an employee. I want to offer you a partnership in this ranch, a genuine partnership, equal share in what we build. He held her gaze. And I am asking you personally, not professionally, because I have been in love with you since about the third week you were here, and I have been very poorly pretending that I was not. The evening was still. The tank water glittered. Far across the pasture, the cattle moved against the hill country horizon like a painted scene. Fannie Vaughn sat in the grass with her wet boots beside her and looked at Abraham Talbot, who had just laid himself entirely open in the most straightforward and undecorated way possible, and she felt the fullness of it in her chest like a breath drawn after too long without one. You have been poorly pretending, she agreed. He made a sound that was half a laugh. Yes. So have I, she said. He turned to her fully. I came here for a job, she said. And I will tell you honestly that the first week I thought you were competent and principled and fairly interesting, and that was enough. And then every week after that there was more of you than I had expected. More patient and more stubborn and more decent and more funny, in the quiet way that is better than the loud way. She looked at him directly, without defense. I have been very careful my whole life not to depend on a place or a person, because the last time I had a place and a person to depend on they went away, and the leaving was terrible. But I cannot pretend that this does not feel like home. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had on the porch in June, and this time she did not look at the hills. She looked at him. I will not go away, he said, and this land is not going anywhere. Abraham, she said, if I stay here as your partner, personal and professional both, I need you to know that I am not decorative and I am not temporary and I am not going to do any part of this halfway. I would not want you any other way, he said. She leaned forward and kissed him, which was the most deliberate and unconflicted thing she had done in a long time, and he kissed her back with the accumulated feeling of 5 months, and when they drew back they were both very slightly out of breath, and the cattle were entirely indifferent and the evening light was extraordinary. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. He was smiling, and it was not his usual controlled half-smile but a full, open expression that changed the whole geography of his face, and she thought she had not seen him look like that before, and intended to see it as much as possible going forward. Ruth Talbot arrived in early September on the afternoon stage from San Antonio, and she was everything Abraham had prepared Fannie for. Brisk, particular, opinionated, and possessed of a scanning analytical intelligence that she brought to bear on every situation without hesitation. She was 35, 5 years older than Abraham, with his same dark eyes and a manner that suggested she had been managing things around her since childhood and found it natural. She looked at Fannie with frank assessment, and Fannie looked back with equal frankness, and Ruth said, after approximately 40 seconds, "My brother said you were good with horses. He neglected to mention the rest of it." "What rest of it?" Fannie asked. Ruth glanced between her and Abraham, who was looking very deliberately neutral. "That you are clearly the reason he sounds like a different man in his letters than he sounded a year ago," she said. "He was going gray before his time. He sounds considerably less gray now." Abraham closed his eyes briefly. "Come in," Fannie said. "Supper is almost ready." Ruth stayed for 10 days. By the end of the 3rd day she was helping in the kitchen garden and asking Fannie detailed questions about the grazing rotation. By the end of the 5th day she had told Fannie about Abraham's childhood. including several stories that Abraham found deeply unnecessary. And Fannie had told Ruth about the trail drives, and the two women had reached the specific understanding of people who are both very capable and recognize it in each other. On the seventh day, Ruth took Abraham aside while Fannie was out on the western boundary and said, with the directness that was a family characteristic, "If you do not marry that woman, I will never forgive you." "I am working on it, Ruth," he said. "Work faster," she said. "She is the best thing that has happened to this ranch and to you, and you should tie it up before she changes her mind." "She is not going to change her mind." Ruth gave him a look that questioned this confidence. "She is not," he said more quietly. "We have talked about it." Ruth looked at him for a moment, and then her expression changed from imperious to something softer. "Good," she said. "That is good, Abraham." He asked Fannie to marry him on the last evening of Ruth's visit, not as a performance for his sister, but because the evening was right, the ranch quiet around them and the stars beginning to show, and Ruth discreetly inside. And Fannie was standing at the corral fence with her arm over Jubilee's neck, the gray mare standing close to her in the easy trust of an animal that has found its person. He came and stood beside her at the fence. He did not have a ring because he had not had time to plan this exactly right, and he was also aware that Fannie was not a woman who required the performance of romance so much as the reality of it. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked at him sideways, and he thought she already knew. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Fannie, will you be my wife and my partner and share this land and this life with me?" She looked at Jubilee for a moment, her hand on the mare's neck, and then she looked at him with everything showing in her face, the private, careful, deeply feeling person she was, the one that all the competence and the practicality and the independence was built on top of, and she said, "Yes, Abraham. Yes." He kissed her there at the corral fence with the stars coming out over the Texas hill country and Jubilee watching them with serene disinterest. And Ruth, who was watching from the window, clasped her hands together and looked very satisfied. They were married in October in Larkin Creek, at the small Methodist church that served the community, which was the plainest church in 3 counties and perfectly suited to them. Fannie wore a dress she had made from blue calico that was not a wedding gown exactly, but was the best dress she had owned in years, and she wore her good boots, polished to a mirror finish, and her hair was pinned up under a small hat with a sprig of the dried herb from the kitchen garden tucked in it. Abraham stood at the front of that small church and watched her walk down the aisle and felt the specific gravity of a moment that is exactly right. And when she reached him and he took her hands, she was looking at him with those clear green eyes, and she was smiling, fully and without reservation. And he thought that if he had tried to design the woman who would make him a better version of himself, he would not have had the imagination for her. The ceremony was short and honest, the way they both preferred. Gideon cried, which surprised no one who knew him. Cole stood up as Abraham's witness with an expression of solemn importance. Ruth sat in the front pew and did not cry but had to look at the ceiling once or twice. After, there was a celebration at the rocking tea, informal and warm, the whole community invited and a good portion of Larkin Creek showing up. There was fiddle music and food, and the particular festivity of a community that has found a reason to gather, and Fannie moved through it with a kind of ease Abraham had not seen from her in public before, more open. The defensive self-sufficiency she had carried softened without being gone. He danced with her on the packed dirt of the yard under the lanterns that Gideon had hung from the oak tree, and the whole of the night was warm and the fiddle was good, and she danced the way she rode, with total commitment and a joy that was purely physical and present, and he thought he would remember this his whole life. Hector Gill sent a formal congratulation by post, which surprised Abraham, until he realized it was Gill's way of signaling a tactical retreat. The survey documentation, the water rights filing, and the rocking tea's demonstrated solidity made the acquisition strategy more costly than it was worth. Gill would not give up entirely on the idea. Men like Hector Gill rarely did, but the immediate pressure had eased and the strategic picture had shifted. "He will wait," Fannie said when Abraham told her about the note. "He will wait," Abraham agreed. "We will be ready for whatever he tries next." "We will," she said. The fall was the best season the rocking T had seen in years. The cattle were healthy, and the western pasture rotation that Fannie had implemented through the summer had the grass in better condition than it had been in a decade. The work on the spring progressed, Abraham contracting a local well man to help with the pipeline, and by November a pipe ran from the western spring to a newly dug third stock tank, clean and full and reliable. The ranch could support more cattle now, and Abraham bought another 60 head at the fall market in San Antonio, bringing the total to 300 head. It was a larger operation than he had ever managed, and he managed it with Fannie beside him, genuinely beside him, her judgment and his combined into something better than either alone. Winter came and was cold and brought its particular challenges, the cold nights that required checking the animals, the frozen water troughs that needed breaking every morning, the cattle that needed supplemental feed when the grass was iced over. Fannie took the cold with the same equanimity she took everything, wrapped in a buffalo hide coat she had acquired somewhere on her trail drive years, and moved through the frozen mornings with brisk purpose. In January, she told him she was expecting their first child. He sat down, not from distress but from the sheer force of joy, which sometimes requires sitting down. She stood in the kitchen looking at him sitting down at the kitchen table, and she was trying to maintain her usual composure and not entirely succeeding, her mouth curved in a smile she could not stop. "Abraham," she said. "I am sitting down," he said. "I see that. Give me a moment." He sat for a moment. Then he stood up and crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her with everything in him showing, all the love and all the joy and the specific terror of someone who has been given more than they dared ask for. "Fannie," he said. "I know," she said. He kissed her forehead and her cheeks and held her, and she let herself be held, which was its own form of trust, the trust of a woman who had held herself up alone for a long time and had decided to allow the comfort of being held. Gideon, when told, sat down at the supper table and was quiet for a long moment, and then said that it was the finest news he had heard in 30 years, and he was not exaggerating. Cole went red to the ears and shook Abraham's hand with great vigor, and said congratulations about 4 times more than was required. Ruth wrote back from Arkansas that she would be arriving in June, 2 months before the baby was due, and intended to stay through the lying in, and her letter had a warmth to it that was the Ruth Talbot equivalent of joyful weeping. The spring of 1883 unfolded with the particular quality of a life that has found its correct arrangement. The rocking T was thriving by every measure. The cattle were in good condition. The grass was recovering beautifully from the previous year's careful management, and the new stock tank was operating exactly as planned. Abraham and Fannie worked through the spring together with the rhythm they had built, efficient and easy, the kind of working partnership that takes most people years and some people never. Fannie did not slow down much in the first months of the pregnancy. She modified what she did, she was careful, she listened to what her body told her, but she was not a woman given to abstaining from a life for theoretical comfort, and she rode and worked and managed with the full engagement that was her nature. Abraham worried sometimes. He did not say so as often as he felt it, because she had made clear that she was not fragile and did not want to be treated as fragile, and he respected that. But he was watchful in the ways he could be, quietly, the way a person takes care of something precious without announcing it. There was one evening in April when she was out on the western boundary on Jubilee, a ride she made regularly to check the fence and the water, and she was later than expected, and the sky had clouded up and the wind had turned, and he stood on the porch watching the western ridge line with his arms crossed, and a feeling in his gut that he did not know what to do with. She came over the ridge at the usual pace, unhurried and whole, and when she rode into the yard and saw his face, she raised her eyebrows. "I am fine," she said before he could speak. "I know," he said. "You were worried." "I was watching the weather," he said. She looked at him with one of her specifically knowing looks. "Abraham, the fence is in good order," he said, changing the subject badly. She swung down from Jubilee and handed him the mare's reins and put her hand briefly against his arm, a small, deliberate contact. "I know what I am doing," she said quietly. "I will tell you if that changes." "I know you will," he said. "Good," she said. "Now go put Jubilee away and I will start supper." He smiled. He went. The summer was warm and full, and the baby came in August. A boy, born on the hottest morning of the year with Ruth in attendance and a local midwife named Dolores Garcia, who had delivered half the babies in Harlan County, and had a steady, capable manner that Fannie appreciated deeply. It was a long labor and not easy, and Abraham sat outside the door for most of it in a state of sustained, controlled dread. And Gideon sat with him, and they did not talk, but Gideon's presence was a comfort in the specific way that old men with long experience are a comfort in hard moments. When Dolores Garcia opened the door and said the mother was well and the baby was well, Abraham stood up and had to put his hand on the wall. He went in. Fannie was propped against the pillows, looking exhausted in a way he had never seen her look, wrung out and pale, but her eyes were open and clear, and there was the small bundled form in her arms, and she looked at him when he came through the door and said, "Come see your son." He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this boy, red and wrinkled and already very loud about his opinions, and felt something in his chest so large it had no name. "He is perfect," he said. His voice came out rough. "He is extremely loud," Fannie said, with the exhausted but genuine humor of a woman who has just done something enormous. "I believe he gets that from your side." "I am a quiet man," he said. "You have hidden depths," she said. He looked at her, this woman he had watched ride in over a hill at a full gallop 16 months ago, who had told him she had run wilder land than this and had proceeded to prove it every day since, who had taken his struggling ranch and helped it become something strong, who had taken his solitary life and made it large. "I love you," he said. It came out simply, because it was simple, because the simplest true things require the plainest language. "I love you, Abraham," she said. They named the boy Samuel, for Abraham's father, in the spirit of gestures toward things that cannot be unsaid but can be offered anyway, the way a man offers his father's name to his son as a form of continued conversation. Samuel Talbot was a very healthy baby and a very demanding one, and the bunkhouse had never heard so much nighttime activity, though Gideon said he did not mind because the sound of a baby crying in the dark was the sound of the ranch having a future, and that was worth some lost sleep. Cole bought a carved wooden toy from the store in Larkin Creek and presented it with the red-eared seriousness of a young man performing his first act in a new era of life. Ruth stayed 6 weeks and then went back to Arkansas, and her parting was tearful in the way that Ruth's emotion expressed itself, briefly and intensely, and with instructions attached, instructions about the baby's feeding schedule and Abraham's need to sleep and Fannie's need to not be too proud to rest. She embraced Fannie at the stage and said, "I did not know what kind of woman would suit my brother. I know now that I could not have invented a better one." Fannie held Ruth's hands and said, "Come back soon." "I will," Ruth said. "This place has started to feel like mine too." The fall came again, and the rocking T was a different entity than it had been 2 years before. 300 cattle, properly grazed on a rotation that kept the land healthy. 3 functioning stock tanks. A sound fence system on every boundary. 2 experienced hands in Gideon and Cole, with Cole having grown into a genuinely skilled stockman under Fannie's observation and Abraham's teaching. A kitchen garden that had expanded to serve the whole crew. A ranch house that felt lived in and full rather than a single man's utilitarian shelter. Hector Gill made one final move in the November of that year. He brought a new legal challenge, contesting the water rights filing on a technical procedural ground that his Uvalde lawyer had apparently spent several months finding. Abraham hired a land attorney from San Antonio, a sharp woman named Mrs. Clara Hendricks, whose presence in the county court raised eyebrows but whose arguments were precise and documented, and utterly without procedural weakness. The challenge was dismissed within 2 weeks. When the dismissal was delivered, Abraham sat at the kitchen table with the legal notice in his hands and Fannie across from him with Samuel in her lap, the boy now 3 months old and deeply interested in the buttons on his mother's jacket, and he read the notice and set it down. "It is done," he said. "For now," Fannie said. "Gil is 60 years old and he has spent 2 years and considerable money trying to take something he could not take," Abraham said. "At some point a man runs the arithmetic." "At some point," she agreed. She looked at him over Samuel's head. "But we will keep the filings current and the fences tight regardless." "Of course we will," he said. She smiled at him with the full warmth of that smile that had been one of the first things he had truly seen in her. And he thought that the particular quality of being known by this woman, being seen clearly and chosen anyway, was the central gift of his life. December brought Christmas, which the rocking tea observed with a simplicity that suited them. A tree cut from the cedar thickets on the eastern creek, candles and strings of dried berries, a good dinner with Gideon and Cole, and a visiting family from the neighboring Calhoun spread who had become genuine friends over the course of the year. Fannie played carols on the small upright piano that Abraham had had delivered from San Antonio in October, a surprise that had stopped her in the doorway of the parlor for a full 10 seconds, which was the longest he had ever seen her stop. "You play," he had said. "My mother taught me," she had said, still looking at the piano. "I thought you might want it," he said. She had turned to look at him with an expression he could not entirely read, deep and warm, and something under it that was the specific emotion of someone who has been understood. On Christmas night, after the company had gone and Gideon and Cole were back in the bunkhouse, Abraham sat in the armchair by the fire with Samuel asleep on his chest, the boy warm and impossible and entirely real, and Fannie sat at the piano and played softly, old songs, Tennessee songs, the ones from the hills and the hollers, and the music filled the ranch house and went out through the walls into the cold night and drifted across the dark land that was theirs. The year turned. 1884 came in cold and clear, and by February Fannie told him there would be another child, which she delivered with the same matter-of-fact directness she brought to all news, as though she were reporting on the cattle count, and he kissed her and she kissed him back and they were both very happy. That spring, Samuel learned to pull himself upright on the corral fence while his mother rode Jubilee in the near pasture, and he watched the horse and rider with absolute fierce attention, the attention of a person who has identified what they want. Fannie brought Jubilee to the fence and let Samuel touch the mare's nose, and the horse breathed warm breath on the boy's small face, and Samuel laughed, which was the sound of the future being entirely fine. In April, Gideon Marsh turned 64 and said it was time he retired to his sister's place in Fredericksburg. He had told Abraham this was coming, and Abraham had prepared for it, hiring 2 new hands in January who were capable young men, a quiet Tejano horseman named Rafael Garza, who had grown up working cattle on the big South Texas spreads, and had a patience with animals that matched Fannie's, and a solid, reliable man from Tennessee named James Whitley, whom Fannie had known by reputation from her trail drive days and had recommended directly. Gideon left on a Wednesday morning with his few possessions in a saddlebag, and the genuinely profound gratitude of everyone on the ranch. Fannie had baked him a pound cake, wrapped in cloth for the journey, and Gideon held it with the care of a man holding something precious, and his eyes were bright. "You take good care of this place," he said to Fannie, and then to Abraham, "You take good care of her." "I try," Abraham said. "Try harder," Gideon said with complete affection and rode away, and Cole watched him go with the expression of a young man seeing his first era end and his second begin. The summer of 1884 was when the rocking T became what Abraham had imagined it could be the first day he had driven through those Texas hills with $30 and an old horse. The land was in the best condition it had ever been. The cattle operation was healthy and increasingly profitable. The Western Spring fed 3 stock tanks now, and there was talk of one more. The ranch house had been expanded with a new room and a real kitchen that replaced the cramped original, and the new kitchen had windows that looked south over the kitchen garden and west toward the limestone hills. The second child was born in September, a girl this time, smaller than Samuel and louder, born in the cool of an early fall morning when the first hint of the season's change was in the air. They named her Clara May, Clara for the sharp attorney who had helped them keep their land, May because it was Fannie's mother's name, the mother who had taught her piano and given her hills to grow up in and gone away too soon. Fannie held Clara May in the afternoon after the birth, with Samuel on the bed beside her investigating his new sister, with a mixture of intense scientific interest and royal consternation at no longer being the sole subject of every adult's attention. And Abraham sat beside them all and thought that this, the specific fullness of this moment, was the answer to every question he had ever asked about why he had come to Texas, why he had stayed, why he had built the way he built. He reached over and took Fannie's hand the way he had on the porch in June of 1882, the same gesture, the first real thing that had passed between them, and she looked at him and her fingers closed around his, and she said quietly, "We built something." "We did," he said. "Something good," she said. "Something very good," he said. He looked around the room at these children, and this woman and this house, and outside the windows the ranch that stretched in every direction. The land that had been hardpan and possibility and was now, through years of work and care, and the particular alchemy of 2 people who had found the person they were looking for, something solid and beautiful and lasting. Cole Purvis, who had grown into a man Abraham trusted completely, had taken on the role of foreman without the official title yet, though Abraham was planning to make it official before the year was out. And Rafael Garza was a genuine asset to the remuda, and had become one of Fannie's valued working partners in the horse management of the ranch. James Whitley had settled in with the easy competence of a man who had found where he fit. The rocking T had a crew now, a real one, and it ran with the coherent efficiency of an operation where everyone understood the whole picture. Hector Gill died in the early winter of 1884. Of a heart condition that had apparently been developing for years, and his spread passed to his children, who had different interests and less appetite for land accumulation, and eventually sold the /H to a family from Missouri who were good neighbors and better ranchers than Gill had ever been. The particular shadow that Gill had cast over the rocking T's western boundary dispersed like morning fog when the sun comes up, and Fannie stood one morning at the top of the western hills and looked out over the limestone country and felt the clean simplicity of a threat that was simply gone. She had run wilder land than this. She had come here by choice and stayed by love and made this land into the thing it was meant to be. She rode Jubilee home at an easy pace, through the morning that was golden and cool, past the new stock tank with the early light on it, past the cattle moving in the east pasture under the watchful circuit of Raphael on his dun horse, past the corrals where the remuda shifted and blew and turned their heads to watch her come, and into the yard where Abraham was coming out of the barn with a coffee mug in his hand and Samuel on his hip. The boy, now a year old, and deeply committed to being involved in every aspect of ranch life, regardless of whether he could walk yet. Abraham looked up when she rode in, and his face did what it always did when she appeared, opened up, became the version of him that no one else saw, unguarded and entirely hers. "Good ride," he said. "Very good," she said. She swung down and looped Jubilee's reins and walked up to him and kissed him good morning, which Samuel found objectionable on the grounds that neither adult was paying attention to him. "Samuel has views," Abraham said. "Samuel always has views," she said, and took the boy from his father's arm and settled him on her hip, and he grabbed her braid with the proprietary confidence of someone who has established ownership through consistent application. "What were you thinking about out there?" Abraham said. He always knew when she had been thinking hard. She looked at him. "I was thinking that I came here to work a ranch," she said, "and I ended up with a life." He looked at her steadily, this man who had handed her a set of reins on a dusty afternoon and said, "Prove it," who had given her the land and then given her everything that was worth more than land. "Is that acceptable?" he said. She smiled fully, the smile that changed her face and always would. "It is considerably more than acceptable," she said. "It is exactly right." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, Samuel between them making complicated observations about the horses. And the morning spread out in every direction, warm and good and entirely theirs. The ranch and the land and the life they had built from work and stubbornness, and the specific courage of two people who had decided that the right answer was not to hold back, but to take the reins and ride. The rocking tea went on from that year and grew steadily, never recklessly, in the way that honest work and good judgment allow things to grow. By 1887, they had added a full second bunkhouse, expanded the cattle to near 500 head, and developed the Western Spring into the water resource it had always promised to be. Samuel grew into a boy who loved horses above everything and followed Fannie through the corrals with single-minded devotion from the moment he could walk. Clara May was fierce and curious, and had her mother's green eyes and her father's deliberate patience, a combination that suggested she would be a formidable person in whatever direction she chose. A third child came in the summer of 1887, a boy they named Gideon after the old man who had already received the news by letter, and written back in a sprawling, barely legible hand that he was honored beyond anything he had words for, and that they had better bring those children to see him in Fredericksburg before he was too old to appreciate them, which they did the following spring. Cole Purvis, who had been with the rocking tea since the beginning, was formally made foreman in 1886 and took to the role with the seriousness of a man who understands the weight of a thing he has worked toward. He married a local woman named Anna, whose family ran a spread 2 counties east, and they built a small house on the rocking tea's northeast corner that became its own pocket of family and life within the larger ranch community. In the evenings, Abraham and Fannie still sat on the porch, now expanded and shaded by the oak tree that had grown considerably in 5 years, and the silence between them was the same as it had always been, comfortable and chosen. The silence of people who have long since stopped needing to fill each other's company with words because the company itself is enough. Sometimes she played the piano after the children were in bed and he sat in the armchair and listened, and the ranch house held the music the way it held everything that made it home, warmly and completely. He told her once, in the middle of an ordinary evening, that he thought the best thing he had ever done was write that advertisement in the San Antonio Express. She had looked at him from the piano bench with that dry, specific humor that still made him smile exactly as it always had. "The best thing you ever did," she said, "was hand me those reins." "You had already told me you had run wilder land," he said. "And you said prove it," she said. "And you did," he said. She turned back to the piano and played a long, warm chord that resonated through the house and out into the Texas night. "I did," she said. "And then some." Outside, the stars over the rocking tea were as thick as they had ever been, the same stars that had shone over the land before Abraham had come, before Fannie had ridden over that hill in a cloud of red dust and changed everything. They would shine after both of them were gone, and the land would remain, tended by their children and their children's children, the spring still running in the western hills, the stock tanks full, the grass rotating through its careful seasons. But that was the future. Tonight the ranch house was lit and warm, and the children were asleep in their beds, and the horses were settled in their stalls, and the cattle were quiet in the good grass. Tonight Abraham Talbot sat in his armchair by the fire and listened to his wife play the piano and knew, with the kind of certainty that only settles in a person after years of tested and proven love, that there was not a thing in this life he would trade, not a single hard season or difficult day, because every one of them had brought him here to her, to the life that fit him the way good leather fits a working hand, shaped by use and made better by it. Fannie Vaughn, who had become Fannie Talbot but remained entirely herself, played the last notes of the evening's last song and let them die away into the warm air of the ranch house, and she felt the fullness of her life settle around her. This land, this man, these children, this place that had been an employer's advertisement in a newspaper and had become the truest home she had ever known. She had come west because she was afraid to stay, and she had found something she was no longer afraid to keep. She had run wild country and wilder ranges, and had come at last to the piece of earth that asked her to stay, and she had stayed, and the staying had made her free. She closed the piano lid softly and turned and found Abraham looking at her the way he had been looking at her since the beginning, with that full, unguarded warmth that was the truest thing she knew about him. And she stood and went to him, and he made room for her, and she settled in beside him in the firelight, his arm around her, the ranch quiet outside, the stars enormous and fixed and faithful above the dark Texas hills. It was, she thought, exactly enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.